Hey, everybody, and welcome to our deep dive. You know him, you love him. It's Stephen Krashen. We're going to be talking all about his theories on language acquisition and what they mean for you as the learner.
Yeah, and I think one of the coolest things about Krashen
All
is
right.
how he really emphasizes making this process feel organic, like almost like how we learn our first language.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting ideas that he came up with is this idea of comprehensible input.
Right.
Have you ever heard of the I+1 concept?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's so central to his work. Really, the idea that you're learning best when you're exposed to language that's just a tad above your current level.
So not too difficult.
Not so hard that you feel lost,
Right.
but just challenging enough to kind of keep you stretching and keep you growing.
So it's not about struggling. It's more about encountering those new words and grammatical structures,
Yeah.
but in a way that you can generally understand. So like if you're watching a movie with subtitles and you're catching maybe like 80 or 90% of the dialogue, but there are a few things that are new to you, that's that sweet spot.
And it's I+1 in action.
Yeah.
And each time you encounter those elements, your brain is making connections and you're naturally absorbing the language without even really realizing it.
I've always wondered about this whole like speaking thing.
Yeah,
Don't we need to practice speaking to become fluent?
right.
Krashen actually says that we should be prioritizing listening and reading, which he calls input, over speaking and writing, which he calls output,
Mm.
especially when we're first starting out.
Yeah, and this is something that often surprises people. They think, oh, to learn a language, I've got to be speaking it all the time.
Right.
But his idea is that focusing too heavily on output, especially too early in the process, can actually increase our anxiety and hinder our fluency.
That makes sense, I guess. Like think about learning to play the piano. You would try to perform a concert before you even learn the basic.
Exactly. You'd start by listening to music and kind of getting familiar with the notes and maybe practicing scales and arpeggios.
Right.
And language is similar. Building a solid foundation of understanding through listening and reading allows speaking and writing to flow more naturally later on.
So before we even open our mouths, we should be focusing on absorbing as much as possible.
Yeah, just taking it all in.
Okay, I like that. Now, Krashen also talks about this thing called the affective filter,
Yes.
which is how our feelings can impact our learning.
Yeah. Have you ever felt really nervous to speak English? Like maybe in a situation and your mind just goes blank?
Oh, absolutely. Like that time I tried to order food and I completely forgot how to say chicken.
Right. That's
Yep.
that affective filter at play.
Oh.
Gratian found that, when we have anxiety and fear, self-doubt, these things, they create a mental block that literally prevents us from absorbing new information.
So it's like a wall.
Yeah, it's like a wall goes up.
Wow.
But when we feel relaxed and motivated, our brains are much more open and receptive to learning.
So basically, having a positive mindset can actually make us better language learners.
Absolutely. It can make a huge difference. Think about it. How much easier is it to focus and make progress when you're genuinely excited to learn something new?
Yeah.
That same principle applies to languages. When we're enjoying the process, our brains are primed for success.
This kind of brings us to Krashen's view of traditional language learning, which he was pretty critical of. Those methods that are really heavy on grammar drills and memorization.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's important to remember that Krashen didn't think grammar was unimportant.
Right.
His critique was more about how it's often taught.
Okay.
He believed that, rote memorization and abstract grammar rules, they create a lot of anxiety
Uh-huh.
and don't necessarily lead to fluency in real life situations.
So instead of like drilling ourselves with verb conjugations, we should be focusing on actually communicating
Right.
and using the language in a natural way.
Exactly. Like, you can't just read a book about swimming. You have to get in the pool and experience it.
You have to get in the water.
Yeah.
That's a good analogy. So less grammar textbooks and more real conversations and interesting stories and immersing ourselves in a way that feels fun and relevant.
Exactly.
Okay, so Krashen also have this idea of the natural order hypothesis.
Yes.
Have you ever noticed how English learners seem to acquire certain grammatical structures before others, regardless of their background?
Yeah, it's like some things just kind of click faster than others.
Right.
And Krashen observed that there is this predictable sequence in which we acquire language, and this order doesn't always match how it's presented in textbooks.
So forcing ourselves to master like complex grammar rules too early might be counterproductive.
It can be. It can lead to frustration, confusion, and, it can activate that affective filter that we were talking about.
So it's all about trusting the process and letting our brains kind of work their magic.
Right, allowing that natural acquisition to take place.
Yeah.
And this is where his emphasis on reading comes in. He was a huge believer in the power of extensive reading for language acquisition. He was a huge proponent of reading, just tons and tons of reading.
Yeah, I love reading, so this is great to hear. But how does just like reading a book help me to learn a new language?
Well, when you read, you're exposed to tons of vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
You see grammar in action in a natural context.
Oh,
And you're constantly, expanding your understanding of how the language works.
right.
Plus, it's low pressure. You can go at your own pace. You can
Yeah.
choose materials that you enjoy.
Yeah, it's like sneaking in those language learning vegetables without even realizing it.
Right. You're learning and having fun at the same time.
I like that.
Yeah.
And that enjoyment factor is so key.
Oh, absolutely.
Going back to the affective filter,
Yeah.
when we're relaxed and we're enjoying ourselves, our brains are just so much more open to learning.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, we've talked about comprehensible input and the affective filter and, focusing on input over output, especially early on,
Right.
and the natural order hypothesis and reading
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
what does this all mean for someone who's actually trying to learn English?
That's a big question.
What it means is instead of getting bogged down in grammar rules
Yeah.
and feeling pressure to speak perfectly right away, you can relax, you can enjoy the process,
Yeah.
and trust that your brain is wired to learn.
So it's more about immersing yourself and letting it seep in rather than trying to force it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are so many fun ways to do that.
Oh, yeah.
You can listen to podcasts and watch movies and TV shows with subtitles, read books and articles,
Okay.
even listen to music in English,
Right.
The key is to find things that interest you,
Right.
that make you want to keep coming back for more.
So if I'm a beginner, should I be looking for resources that are like specifically designed for English language learners?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
There are tons of amazing resources out there that are tailored for different levels.
Okay.
As you progress, you can gradually challenge yourself with, materials that are more authentic.
Got it. What are some of your favorite resources for English learners?
Oh, there's so many great ones. But a few that come to mind are podcasts like Voice of America Learning English,
Okay.
All Ears English, 6-Minute English. These are podcasts that cover a wide range of topics
Mhm.
and use really clear, easy to understand language.
Those sound great. I'll
Yeah.
have to check those out.
Yeah.
What about movies and TV shows? Any recommendations there?
For beginners, animated movies and TV shows are a great option
Mm-hmm.
because the language tends to be a bit simpler
All right.
and the visuals provide a lot of context.
That's a good tip. I never thought about that.
Yeah, and as you get more comfortable, you can move on to sitcoms and dramas and movies with subtitles.
Good.
Don't worry if you don't understand every single word.
Right.
The goal is just to kind of get the gist and have fun while you're doing it.
So gradually increasing the challenge and pushing yourself outside your comfort zone, but not so much that it's overwhelming.
Exactly. And remember, it's okay to use subtitles.
Mm.
Look up words. You're not expected to understand everything perfectly right away.
I think a lot of people get hung up on trying to be perfect,
Yeah,
and that just takes the joy out of learning.
absolutely. Learning a language is a journey, not a race.
Right.
It's about embracing the process, the ups and downs, the aha moments, and yes, even the mistakes.
Speaking of mistakes,
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone listening has made their fair share.
Oh, we all have. We all have, and that's okay.
Right.
Mistakes are a natural part of learning. In fact, they're essential for growth.
I like that.
Each time you make a mistake, you're learning something new about the language.
So instead of beating ourselves up over our mistakes,
Hmm.
we should view them as valuable feedback.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like those fail compilations you see online.
Oh, yeah.
They're funny because we can all relate to those moments of, awkwardness and imperfection.
Right.
But what's important is that we get back up and keep trying.
Yeah.
The same applies to language learning. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Embrace them, learn from them, and keep moving forward.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we forget that even native English speakers make mistakes. It's part of being human.
Absolutely. Language is a living, breathing thing. It's constantly evolving. Even the most fluent speakers, make mistakes. They use slang and they adapt their language to different situations.
Right.
The goal isn't to be perfect. The goal is to be able to communicate effectively and confidently.
And that confidence comes from practice, right?
It does. It comes from practice, and it comes from feeling comfortable making mistakes.
Right.
The more you allow yourself to experiment with the language, the more confident you'll become.
So find those opportunities to speak, even if it's scary at first,
Yeah.
whether it's with a language partner in an online community or just talking to yourself in the mirror.
Yeah.
The more you practice, the more natural it will become.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to be perfect.
Right.
Just focus on getting your message across.
Yeah.
And enjoying the experience.
Yeah. That's great advice.
Yeah.
And that ties back into the affective filter.
Right.
The more relaxed and comfortable we feel, the more receptive our brains are to learning.
Absolutely. So find ways to make learning English enjoyable for yourself. Watch funny movies, listen to upbeat music, connect with other learners, and celebrate your progress along the way.
Yeah.
The more fun you have, the more motivated you'll be to keep learning.
Yeah. I think it's easy to get caught up in like the seriousness of it all
Yeah.
and kind of forget to have fun.
It's like anything else, you know? If it feels like a chore, you're less likely to stick with it.
Right.
But if you can find a way to make it fun and engaging, then it becomes something that you look forward to.
Totally. And one thing I love about Krashen is he really emphasizes that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Absolutely.
So it's all about kind of experimenting
Yeah.
and finding what works best for you.
It's about taking ownership of your learning journey.
Yeah.
And figuring out what makes you tick, you know? Maybe you love watching movies. Maybe you prefer listening to podcasts.
Yeah.
The key is to tap into those interests and use them as fuel for your language learning.
It's like making your own personal language learning recipe.
I love that.
You take the core ingredients, Krashen's principles,
Yeah.
and then you add your own spices and flavors to create something unique and delicious.
That's a great analogy. And remember, it's okay to tweak the recipe along the way.
Right.
You might find that certain methods work better for you at different stages,
Yeah.
but the important thing is to stay flexible and adapt as needed.
So if we were to distill all of Krashen's wisdom into a few key takeaways,
Okay.
what would they be?
I think the most important takeaway is to focus on creating a positive and enjoyable learning environment for yourself.
Yeah.
Minimize that affective filter by choosing activities you genuinely enjoy,
Okay.
setting realistic goals, and celebrating your progress along the way.
And remember, input is king, especially in the beginning. Immerse yourself in the language through listening and reading, and trust that the speaking and writing will kind of develop naturally.
Absolutely.
And don't get bogged down by the grammar rules early on. Let your brain absorb those patterns naturally through exposure.
Right.
And find ways to make it fun.
Yes.
Whether it's, watching a funny movie,
Yeah.
listening to catchy music, or connecting with other learners,
Right.
the more enjoyable you make it, the more likely you are to stick with it.
Exactly. It's like we said earlier, learning a language should be a joy, not a chore.
Well said.
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah,
Remember, everyone can learn English with the right approach and a little bit of fun.
that's right. So go out there, embrace the challenge, and enjoy the journey.